Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I've had my fair share of nights in the woods where I felt uneasy, but 3 times stand out to me as the kind that left me with that pit in my stomach, the kind of nights that change how you look at camping forever. The first was with my wife, the second with my best friend, and the third with just my dog for company. They were all different, but each one got under my skin in its own way, and I still think about them whenever I pack up my gear. The time with my wife started off as the kind of trip that should have been perfect. We were camped in a forest of jack pines, tall, thin trees that creak and sway, even in a gentle breeze. The air had been still most of the day, warm and clear. But just after the sun went down, the wind started picking up. At first, it was just the kind of gusts that rattle the tarp and shake the branches a little. Then it turned into something else entirely. I remember lying there, my headlamp off, just listening to the sound of the wind rushing through the treetops. It started to sound less like air and more like the roar of a freight train. The trees bent and cracked around us, and I realized this wasn't just wind anymore. This was a storm that was tearing the forest apart. The noise was unbelievable. Branches were ripping free and crashing down, and every few seconds I heard that sharp crack of wood splitting as whole trees gave way. Jack pines don't have the thick, sturdy trunks of some other trees. They're brittle, and they snap more than they bend. Lying there in the tent, I couldn't tell which ones were falling, just that they were. Each crash felt like it was coming closer. I pressed my hand against the thin fabric above me and wondered what would happen if a tree came down on top of us. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were in the middle of the woods, surrounded on all sides, and all we could do was hope the storm passed without one of those giants coming straight down on us. The ground even trembled a few times when bigger ones hit. I could smell fresh pine sap in the air where they split open, sharp and sticky. I don't know how long it lasted, but it felt endless lying there waiting for one of those crashes to be the one that ended right where we were. When morning finally came, the forest looked like a war zone. Big trunks crisscrossed the ground, splintered stumps standing where they had broken off, branches everywhere. We walked around quietly, both of us still a little stunned at how bad it had been. That was the first time I realized how powerless you can feel in the woods, just waiting for nature to decide whether you were in the wrong spot at the wrong time. The next time was completely different, but in some ways, even stranger. I was camping with my best friend in a semi-remote spot. You could drive there, but only if you had a good 4x4, and even then, the road was rough enough that most people wouldn't bother. The area wasn't fully wild, but it wasn't exactly looked after either. There were a couple of fire pits dug into the ground, old picnic tables that were more rot than wood, and an outhouse that looked like it hadn't been cleaned or touched in years. Park staff might have checked on it once a year, if that. It was the kind of place where you could spend days and never see another person, and that's part of why we liked it. It was quiet, simple, and away from the crowds. We pulled in, got out, and started setting up camp. I was getting the tent poles sorted when he wandered off toward the outhouse. A minute later, I noticed him standing at the first door with it open, just staring. He closed it after a second, walked over to the second one, and went inside instead. I didn't think much of it. Figured maybe the first one was disgusting. Maybe an animal had crawled in and died. When he came back, he told me I should take a look. Curiosity got the better of me, so I went over. When I opened the door, I froze. Inside, sitting neatly on the floor in front of the toilet, were 3 full-size backpacks. Big ones, the kind you'd use for a full week-long trip. I stepped closer, expecting maybe they belonged to someone still camping nearby. Maybe left there to keep them dry. But it was strange. No one else was around. No other vehicles. Nothing. Just those bags. We were nosy, so we unzipped them. The first 2 were full of gear. Good quality stuff, too. Tents, sleeping bags, cooking supplies, clothes, the kind of thing you'd need for serious camping. Nothing unusual, other than the fact that it was all sitting abandoned in a rotting outhouse. The third bag, though, this one was different. When I opened it, it was packed full of Skittles. I mean, every kind of Skittles you could imagine. Big bulk bags, little snack packs, regular, sour, tropical, every flavor and size. 80 liters worth of nothing but candy. That was it. No food, no gear, just bag after bag of brightly colored sugar. I just stared at it, trying to process what I was looking at. Why would anyone carry that much candy into the woods? Why hide it in an outhouse? Where were they now? We camped for 4 days in that spot, and not once did we see another person. Every morning and every evening I'd glance over at that outhouse, expecting someone to come back for their stuff, but nobody did. When we finally packed up to leave, the backpacks were still there, untouched, sitting just as we'd found them. Once we got back to civilization, we let the conservation officers know. I don't know what they ever made of it, but I still think about those bags. Someone had hauled in all that gear and all that candy, then disappeared. Maybe they planned to come back, maybe they didn't. I'll never know. All I know is it was strange, and the forest has a way of swallowing up answers. The last one wasn't strange so much as it was downright dangerous. It was just me and my dog that time. It wasn't a long trip, just a spur of the moment overnight. Parked off a back road, walked in a little ways and set up a simple tarp shelter. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep the dew off in the night. I got a small fire going and sat there listening to the night settle in. It wasn't completely hidden, but it wasn't obvious either. I figured I was far enough from the road to be left alone. I was just starting to doze off when I heard the sound of an engine ripping up nearby. A truck. Then came the voices, loud, drunk, and slurred. The kind of voices that don't care how much noise they make. I tensed up, hoping they would pass by. Then the gunshots started. At first just a few, then more. Laughter, shouting, and the crack of rifles echoing through the dark. My stomach dropped when I realized the direction they were firing lined up almost perfectly with where I was camped. I don't think they knew I was there, but it didn't matter. Bullets don't care if you're visible or not. The ground was uneven, and I was tucked out of sight, but I couldn't shake the thought that one stray shot could come tearing through the trees and hit me. My dog felt it too, ears flat, tail down, pressed tight against me. I clipped the leash on him, held it short, and quietly packed up what I could. I didn't risk the fire, didn't risk making any noise. I just slipped into the dark, heart pounding, moving away as fast and as quietly as I could. The shooting and shouting carried on behind me, echoing through the forest until eventually it grew faint and then stopped. I didn't breathe easy until I was back at the truck, engine running, putting miles between me and that place. Those 3 nights were all different kinds of fear. The storm reminded me how small I was compared to nature. The outhouse reminded me how strange people can be, how you never really know what you might stumble across out there. And the drunken shooting reminded me how quickly things can turn deadly, even if you're minding your own business. They were all lessons and they all stuck with me. Every time I head back out now, I think about them. I check the trees above my tent. I notice the little odd things left behind. I listen for voices and engines in the night. The woods are beautiful, but they're not tame. They hold storms and secrets and people you don't want to cross paths with. And the only reason I'm here to tell these stories is because, each time, I was lucky enough to walk away. When I think back to that trip in Arizona, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the quiet beauty of the desert or the stars spread across the night sky. It's the sound of something sniffing right outside my tent. That sound is etched into my head, deep and clear, the kind of memory you can replay without effort. The way the nylon of the tent barely separated me from whatever was on the other side, the sound vibrating through the thin material. It felt like the barrier between me and it could be gone with just a quick swipe. We had gone camping in the middle of nowhere. No towns nearby, no signs of life except for the occasional dirt road we had crossed hours earlier. Arizona has those stretches of land where it feels like no one has touched the place in years. Dry air, sand, scattered brush, and the sharp outlines of mountains off in the distance. We thought it would be the perfect place for a group trip. Away from noise, away from work, away from the constant hum of phones and people. Just the quiet of the desert. That's what we were after. We set up camp late in the day. The sun was still hanging low, casting long shadows across the dirt and rock. Everyone was in a good mood. We had hauled coolers out of the trucks, unloaded tents, dragged folding chairs out, and set up around a fire pit we made from rocks. There were jokes about who would burn the first hot dog, arguments over where to put the tents, the usual chaos of group camping. As it got darker, the fire glowed brighter against the emptiness around us. The sky turned purple, then dark blue, and then black. The stars came out strong, like they only do when you're far from anything man-made. I remember tilting my head back and seeing them stretch in every direction, more than I could count. It made me feel small, and for a moment that was the good kind of small. We stayed up talking, eating, and letting the night set in. I went to bed late, belly full, skin warm from the fire, thinking nothing could ruin the trip. The desert was silent in that heavy way where you can hear every small shift of sound. A bug moving, a breeze brushing against the tent, the crackle of the last embers dying down. It didn't take me long to fall asleep, and then I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire outside was out, and the inside of the tent was so dark that I could barely see my own hand. But then I heard it, sniffing. The kind of sound a dog makes when it presses its nose into something, sharp and wet but stretched out, like it was testing the air. It was right at the wall of the tent, moving slowly along the side. My stomach dropped. The first thought that came to me was that it was a bear. Maybe a coyote, maybe something else that lived out there, but my mind went straight to a bear. I cursed myself silently, wondering if anyone had bothered to tie up the garbage bags or seal the coolers. We were a group of idiots, and it would be just like one of us to leave food sitting out. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tight, waiting to hear it move away. Instead, the sniffing continued, sliding along the fabric. I could track it by sound, moving from the spot near my head, around the side of the tent. The air in the tent felt heavier. No one said anything, but I could tell everyone else in there was awake too. You can feel that tension. When no one moves, no one breathes, but everyone is listening to the same thing. A few seconds later, the sniffing faded from our tent and picked up at the one next to us. That sound of slow, deliberate breathing and dragging footsteps. I gripped the sleeping bag tighter, fighting the urge to unzip the tent and shine a light. I didn't want to see what was out there. Sometimes it's worse to know. Then, all at once, the quiet cracked. A zipper pulled open. Someone in another tent got out. I heard footsteps, fast and uneven, and then a voice shouting, screaming. The sound of noise made on purpose, like someone trying to scare off an animal. My heart jumped into my throat. The shouting was sharp, full of panic and force. Then I heard the sound that cut through everything. It wasn't claws or paws on the ground. It wasn't the low growl of an animal. It was footsteps. Heavy, uneven footsteps moving fast, crunching dirt. That was when I understood. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a coyote. It was a person. The realization made my skin crawl. I could imagine someone hunched over, going through our food, pressing their face to the tents, sniffing like they had some right to be there. The thought made me cold inside. One of my friends chased him off, shouting, running after him, and then silence followed. No more footsteps. Just the empty air of the desert around us. We didn't wait. Everyone came out of the tents, hearts racing, voices low and urgent. We started shoving everything into bags, tossing gear into the trucks, no one caring about neatness. We just wanted out. The fire pit was left cold, half-packed chairs thrown in, tents collapsed without care. The engines roared to life and we drove off into the night, headlights cutting through the dirt road. No one spoke much. We didn't even decide where to go. We just drove until the horizon started to gray with the first hint of morning. That should have been enough. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A year later, we went back. Same area, same kind of trip, same group of dumb friends. The logic was that lightning doesn't strike twice. We told ourselves the guy we'd seen before had probably been some drifter, some random lunatic passing through. It was a one-time thing. We weren't going to let fear own us, so we returned. We tried to be smarter about it. This time we didn't use tents. Instead, we parked the trucks and SUVs in a loose circle, close enough that the fire in the middle lit us all. We laid sleeping bags and blankets in the truck beds in the backs of SUVs, thinking the metal and glass would make us safer. No one could press up against us in the same way. No one could sniff at thin nylon. We thought it was foolproof. The day was almost identical to the year before. Setting up camp, fire glowing, stars overhead. The mood was lighter, though underneath it, I could feel the tension. We didn't talk about what had happened before, but everyone remembered. We were trying to cover it with laughter and food, but the edge was there. As the fire burned low, we climbed into our makeshift beds. The desert air cooled fast, dry and biting. Wrapped in my blanket, I felt myself sink into the hard surface of the SUV. My girlfriend beside me. The fire flickered faintly in the corner of my vision. One of my friends was snoring near it, the sound steady. And then I felt it. A light. A bright artificial light across my face. It was so sudden, so strong, that I nearly opened my eyes fully and cursed. But something in me, deep and instinctive, told me not to move, not to give myself away. I forced my eyelids shut, keeping my body still, pretending to be asleep. My heartbeat was hammering in my chest, each thud loud in my ears. I prayed my girlfriend would stay still too. The light hovered, pressed against my closed eyes, and then slowly moved away. I listened hard, waiting, straining. I heard footsteps. Slow, measured steps across the dirt. Then the light shifted again, spilling into another truck bed. My friends were there. I risked the smallest movement, lifting my eyelids just enough to see. It was a man. Not an animal. Not some random shadow. A man. Older, hair long and gray, face pale in the moonlight. He stood there with a flashlight pointing it directly at the trucks, staring at the people inside as if he was inspecting them. Not moving, not saying a word. Just staring. The sight made me sick. It felt wrong in a way I can't explain. Like watching something private being invaded. He moved from truck to truck. Slow. Deliberate. Shining the light, staring. No rush. Like he had all the time in the world. I held my breath, every muscle tense, waiting for him to leave. Finally, the light pulled away from the last truck. I heard the crunch of footsteps fade into the darkness beyond our camp. That was when I couldn't take it anymore. I shot up, scrambled out, and ran to wake the others. My voice was sharp, loud, desperate. But I didn't have to explain much. Most of them had been awake too, pretending just like me, lying there still while that man stared. We didn't argue. We didn't wait. Everyone knew exactly what to do. We gathered what little we had unpacked, threw it into the vehicles, and left. Engines roaring, tires spitting dirt. We sped out of there without looking back. I don't remember what time we stopped or where. All I remember is the silence inside the truck, the exhaustion of adrenaline, the way none of us wanted to admit how close we had been to just lying there, watched by a stranger in the middle of nowhere. That night taught me something. The wilderness isn't just empty space. It's open, exposed, vulnerable. You think it's peaceful because it's quiet, but that same silence makes every sound matter. And when you're out there, far from anyone else, the line between safety and danger is thin. One person, one choice, one wrong night, and it all shifts. I don't camp near Tucson anymore. Not after that. I grew up in a family that camped every summer. It was never really a choice for me, it was just what we did. Once school was out and the weather got warm, the routine began. We'd pull the camping gear out of the shed, sort through the bins of old mismatched supplies, shake out the musty sleeping bags, and start talking about where the trip would be that year. Most of the time we rotated between a few familiar spots. Virginia Beach, Assateague, and this awful place called Westmoreland. Virginia Beach was fine. A little crowded, but still fun because there was a lot to do. Westmoreland was my least favorite. Buggy, muggy, and just kinda depressing. But Assateague was different. The island had its own kind of magic, even if I didn't see it that way when I was a kid. Wild ponies roamed freely, sometimes walking right through campsites like they owned the place. The salty air always seemed heavier there, clinging to your skin even at night. The dunes stretched out, the ocean roared endlessly just beyond them, and the marshlands on the other side were alive with birds and bugs. There was something both alive and lonely about the place. And when you were camping out there, away from the comfort of a house or solid walls, you felt that in your bones. This particular trip, the memory that still sticks with me, we had chosen Assateague. I don't remember how old I was exactly. Young enough that I wasn't fully able to put logic ahead of fear, but old enough to remember every detail. Our family set up 2 tents in different spots on the site. My parents took one and us kids stayed in the other. But sometimes, depending on the night, I'd end up in the tent with my mom. That's where I was that night. The evening had started like so many camping nights did. We made a fire, cooked over it, ate until our fingers were greasy and our clothes smelled like smoke. My dad fussed with the cooler, my siblings argued about marshmallows, and my mom tried to keep some semblance of order before the sugar hit and everyone went wild. Once the fire burned low, we shuffled into the tents, unzipped the flaps, kicked off our shoes at the edge, and climbed into the stuffy fabric space that smelled like nylon, dirt, and sunscreen. The sand always got into everything. No matter how careful you were, the floor of the tent always had grit under the sleeping bags. I fell asleep to the sound of the ocean, a steady background roar that was comforting in its own way. The nights at Assateague could be oddly bright if the moon was out, and I remember patches of silvery light pressing through the thin tent walls, cutting shadows across the fabric. It wasn't pitch dark like camping in the woods. At some point in the night, I stirred awake. At first, I thought it was just me shifting in my sleep, but then I realized my mom was sitting straight up. She wasn't moving, just sitting there in her sleeping bag, her body rigid. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I followed her gaze toward the wall of the tent. The moonlight was filtering through, and on the other side, right against the fabric, was the outline of something that froze me. It looked like a person. More specifically, it looked like the profile of an old woman, stooped slightly forward with long, wiry hair hanging down. The figure wasn't pressed close like someone leaning on the tent. It stood just outside, the shadow stretched and shaped by the light. The hair caught my eye most of all, wild and stringy, not neat or clean. I was young and my brain filled in the blanks the way a child's brain does. To me, it was an intruder, a stranger, some old woman who had wandered into our campsite in the middle of the night. Maybe crazy, maybe dangerous. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped, and every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I remember gripping my sleeping bag so tightly my fingers hurt. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe too loud. But my fear was bigger than my control, and before long I was making small noises, half whispers, half whimpers, directed at my mom, trying to ask her who it was, what was happening. The sound must have carried, because in that instant the shadow jerked slightly, then bolted. The sudden movement startled me almost as much as the figure itself had. 1 second it was standing there, frozen in that eerie stillness, and the next it was gone, the shadow vanishing as the thing outside darted away. I heard the rush of movement in the sand, quick, heavy, but not the way a person runs. It was too fast, too awkward. That's when the truth came into focus, like someone had pulled back a curtain. It wasn't an old woman at all. It was one of the feral ponies that live on the island. In the moonlight, the shape of its mane had looked like tangled human hair, and the way its body had been angled made it seem hunched, like a person bent forward. The silence, the way it lingered so close to the tent, it had all fed into my mind's worst assumptions. But the moment it moved, its real form betrayed itself. The hooves clattered softly against the sand. The sound of a large body shifted with power, and then it was gone, heading toward the beach. Later, we realized the tents had been set up right across one of the trails the ponies used regularly to get down to the water. We hadn't thought much about it when choosing the spot. There was flat ground, enough space for both tents, and it felt tucked away enough to be comfortable. But what felt convenient for us was just in the way for them. They weren't interested in us, not really. They were just moving through the land they knew, following the same routes they always had, and our nylon walls happened to be in the way. Even with the explanation, the fear didn't drain out of me quickly. That silhouette stayed burned into my memory. The image of what I thought I saw and what it really was overlapped in my mind, tangled together in a way I couldn't easily separate. In the dark, it had been a woman, a stranger, someone I couldn't understand. In the light of memory, it was only a horse, just one of the countless animals that made that island their home. By morning, there were tracks in the sand near the tent, hooves pressed deep where the pony had lingered. The air smelled faintly of salt and manure. It was proof that what had happened was real, even if my mind had twisted it into something else in the moment. My siblings laughed when they heard, teasing me for being scared of a horse, but the fear had been real, and in the middle of the night, it had felt like something far worse. That's the thing about camping in a place like Assateague. You think you're just going for the beach, for the fun of being outdoors, for the novelty of sleeping under the stars. But the reality is you're stepping into a place that belongs to the animals first. They know the trails, the dunes, the marshes. They know the night in a way we don't. Out there, you're just a guest, and sometimes you forget that until something reminds you. For me, that reminder came in the form of a silhouette in the moonlight that I'll never be able to unsee. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some nightmare made flesh. It was a pony. And yet, in the dark, in that fragile space between sleep and wakefulness, it had been enough to terrify me. To this day, when I think back on camping trips, that's the night that comes to mind first. Not the s'mores or the beach or the sunrise over the dunes, but that shadow outside the tent, the one that taught me how easily the mind can trick itself when fear takes over. I always liked hiking deep into Georgia's backwoods, the kind of trails where you go far enough in that the noise of cars, people in the modern world just completely disappears. That silence has its own weight, pressing down on you until the only things left are the crackle of a fire, the sound of your own breath, and the movement of whatever wild things are out there in the dark. We made a habit of it, my friend and I, packing light, picking a trailhead, and putting in a few miles before setting up camp for the night. 3, maybe 5 miles in, just enough to feel like we were truly alone, deep in it, with no one around but each other and the woods. This particular trip was in mid-fall, and while fall in Georgia can get cool, it's almost never harshly cold. But that night, the weather betrayed us. We had been sweating during the hike-in, shirts sticking to our backs, and by the time we set up camp, the air was crisp but still comfortable. We cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate until our bellies were full, and leaned back in the comfort of the flames, letting exhaustion take over. The last thing I remember before drifting off was staring into the shifting shapes of orange light, listening to the occasional pop of sap in the firewood. I felt safe, heavy with food, and wrapped in that primal warmth you only get when you've earned it on a long trail. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. It wasn't the cold that stirred me, though the temperature had dropped far lower than expected. Later we found out it had slipped down into the low 20s, which for mid-fall in Georgia is nearly unheard of. I woke because something was touching my foot. Not in a threatening way, just a soft tap, then another. I opened my eyes to see my friend crouched a few feet away holding a stick, the end of it poking toward me. His face was tense, lips pressed into a line, eyes wide, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me. I followed his gaze toward the fire. The fire was no longer blazing. It had burned down to a glowing bed of embers, just enough to throw a soft red light onto the clearing around us. And in that faint light I saw them, 2 wild boars, big and heavy, rooting and pawing at the ground near the fire pit. Their dark bristled coats shimmered with a faint sheen in the glow, their bodies solid and powerful. They weren't small by any means, easily 150 pounds each, maybe more, and I knew enough about them to know exactly what kind of danger we were in. Wild boars in Georgia aren't like the cartoon pigs people picture. They're aggressive, unpredictable, and have sharp tusks that can rip a person apart. They don't need a reason to charge. They just do. And we had nothing. No rifle, no bow, not even a machete. The only thing resembling a weapon we had was a hand axe, and it wasn't beside us. It was propped against a log near the fire, maybe 5 or 6 feet away, completely out of reach without drawing attention. I didn't move. My friend didn't move. We just laid there in our bags, barely breathing, watching. The boars snorted and shuffled, their snouts tearing at the dirt, occasionally swinging their heads toward the fire, as though irritated by the fading heat. Every so often, one of them would stomp its hoof into the ground, spraying dirt and ash. They circled slowly, not quite acknowledging us, but not ignoring us either. The fire's glow caught on their tusks, and every time I caught that gleam, a wave of cold swept through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I had always thought that if I was in danger, adrenaline would make me bold, make me leap up and act, but the truth was I felt frozen. Every muscle in my body locked tight. I was acutely aware of how thin the nylon of my sleeping bag was, how useless it would be against a charge. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears I thought for sure they would hear it. The minutes dragged on. My friend and I didn't exchange a single word. We didn't dare. We just watched as the boars rooted around the embers, sometimes pausing, sometimes snorting loudly and shaking their heads. Their smell drifted over to us, musky, earthy, sour in a way that made my stomach twist. It was the smell of something wild, something that didn't belong anywhere near the fragile bubble of safety a campfire usually provides. The temperature continued to drop, and I could feel the cold air sneaking into my bag, settling on my face, biting at my fingers. Normally, I'd pull the bag tighter, shift around, get comfortable, but any movement now felt like a death sentence. My body ached from the stillness, muscles screaming to adjust, but I held on. Every time one of the boars lifted its head and sniffed the air, my chest tightened, and I froze even harder, terrified that it had caught our scent. An hour passed like that, maybe more. Time stretched out unnaturally, every second feeling longer than the last. The fire sank lower and lower, until even the embers dimmed, and the clearing was swallowed up in darkness. Only then, as if satisfied, the boars began to wander off. Slowly, they turned away from the pit, snorting and grunting, their heavy bodies disappearing into the black tree line. I kept my eyes locked on the spot where they vanished for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound of them crashing back through the brush. But it didn't come. They were gone. Even then, I didn't move. Neither of us did. We stayed still long after they had left, not willing to believe it was really over. Finally, when the silence of the woods settled back in, my friend lowered the stick and eased himself back into his bag. My body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the tension finally letting go. I wanted nothing more than to sit up, to throw more wood on the fire, to build that protective wall of light and heat back up. But I didn't. The fear of drawing them back was too strong, so we lay there in near-freezing air, without fire, without warmth, listening to the forest shift and creak around us. My toes burned with cold, my fingers stiff, but I didn't sleep again that night. I just stared into the black, ears straining for any sign of them returning. By morning, the ground was frosted over, our breath puffing out invisible clouds. The fire pit was cold and gray. We moved slowly, speaking little, each of us still rattled from the night. When the sun finally filtered down through the trees and the world looked alive again, we packed up quickly, shoulders tight, eyes scanning every shadow. The woods that had felt peaceful when we arrived now seemed full of hidden threats, every rustle in the brush making my chest clench. The hike back out was silent. Neither of us wanted to admit just how close we might have been to serious injury. Or worse. We didn't need to say it. We both knew. That night, lying on the frozen ground, watching those boars root and stomp just feet away, I realized something that stuck with me. Out there, far from anyone who could help, you are completely at the mercy of whatever decides to cross your path. No matter how many times you've hiked, no matter how prepared you think you are, you're never in control. We were lucky. Lucky they didn't smell us. Lucky they didn't spook. Lucky they wandered off instead of charging. I've been back on the trails since then plenty of times. But I never forget that night. I never forget the sound of their hooves tearing into the dirt, the flash of tusk in the firelight, the way the cold pressed in as the fire died, and every time I set up camp now, I keep that hand axe within arm's reach. 'Cause the woods don't care who you are or how tired or how confident. Out there in the deep dark, you're just another animal trying to make it through the night. And sometimes, you only make it because something meaner, heavier and angrier than you decides by chance to let you be. I woke up to the sound of rustling, a dry crackle that felt too close. At first, it didn't register as anything unusual. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, in the deep silence of northern wilderness, the smallest noises can feel amplified. The canvas of the tent seemed to make every sound louder, carrying even the faintest scratch of a twig through the thin fabric. I lay there, still caught in the fog of sleep, thinking maybe it was just wind or maybe some bird scratching through the undergrowth. But then it didn't stop. It grew heavier, steadier, like something bigger was moving, something pressing through the brush close enough that I could almost feel the weight of it in the air. I sat up slowly, trying not to wake her beside me. My head was still heavy with sleep, my thoughts not yet lined up. I strained to listen, blinking in the faint light that seeped through the tent wall. The noise was close, so close I couldn't tell if it was behind us or right up against the tent itself. My pulse started to kick harder, though I told myself not to overreact. Out here, noises like that could be anything. Maybe a deer nosing around, maybe a squirrel that sounded louder than it was. That's what I wanted to believe. But before I could settle on what to do, the noise changed. There was a shift, a sudden press of weight against the side of the tent, and then in an instant the entire wall on my side caved in on me. The weight hit my shoulder, then my chest, folding the canvas down like it was paper. I barely had time to breathe. It was heavy, solid, pressing me flat. For a second I couldn't even think. My first raw thought was that the tent had collapsed. Maybe a pole had snapped. But there was too much weight, far more than fabric and wood could explain. It wasn't just the tent, it was something else, something on top of it. The pressure stayed for only a moment, maybe a second or two, but it was enough to feel like I was pinned. Then it lifted, sudden and quick, like whatever it was had jumped back in surprise. I shoved the fabric off my face and scrambled to sit upright. She was awake now, too, eyes wide in the dim light, both of us confused, breathing hard. My hands fumbled at the zipper, tugging it down in quick jerks. The morning air burst in, cool and sharp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and river water. I shoved the flap open and looked out. Only a few steps away, standing among the low brush, was a black bear. Its fur was dark and glossy, its shoulders rising and falling with quick breaths. Its eyes were fixed on us, and in that instant there was nothing else in my vision but the size of it, the weight of its presence so close to where we had been sleeping. It wasn't charging. It wasn't roaring, but it was watching with a look that made it hard to breathe. The bear shifted its head slightly, ears pricked, as if it was just as startled as we were. My mind raced to piece together what had happened. The bear must have been foraging right behind the tent, maybe digging through the bushes for berries or roots, and somehow it had leaned or stumbled forward, pressing its weight directly onto the side of the tent. That explained the sudden collapse, the crushing heaviness that had felt like a wall had fallen on me. It had sat on me, even if only for a second. A bear, something I had always imagined at a distance, lumbering far off in the woods, had been close enough to push me flat in my own tent. I stayed frozen for what felt longer than it was. The bear blinked, shifting its paws in the leaves. It looked confused, maybe spooked, like it hadn't meant to get that close. For a moment we were both caught staring, two creatures that had surprised each other in a place far from anyone else. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the bear turned, crashing back into the trees. The sound of it pushing through the brush faded quickly, swallowed by the forest. Silence came back slowly. My chest was still tight, my breaths uneven. I crawled the rest of the way out of the tent and stood on the damp earth, my legs shaky under me. The tent wall was crumpled but not torn, still sagging where it had folded in. I looked down at the ground and could see the flattened brush, the faint prints pressed into the dirt where the bear had been. 10 feet away, maybe less, that was the space between where I stood and where the animal had stopped. I tried to collect myself, to make sense of what had just happened. Out here in the northern wilderness, miles and miles from the nearest road, the rules were simple. You gave the land and the animals respect, you kept your food sealed, you stayed aware. But no amount of preparation could have predicted that moment, that a bear would stumble and end up pressing me flat against the ground inside my own tent. We stayed still for a long while, waiting, listening for any sign that it might return. But the woods gave us nothing more. The air felt too sharp, the silence too deep, like the whole forest had paused after the sudden burst of chaos. Slowly the ordinary sounds came back, the distant call of a bird, the faint ripple of water from the riverbank, the whisper of wind through the tall trees. Life resumed, but something inside me hadn't yet. Later, when I thought back on it, I could almost laugh at the strangeness of it. How many people could say they had been sat on by a bear and lived to talk about it? It was absurd, almost unbelievable, but in the moment there had been nothing funny about it. In the moment, all I had felt was the crushing weight, the raw instinct that this was something far beyond my control, something that could end me if it chose to. That kind of closeness strips everything down to survival. No noise of civilization, no distractions, just me, the thin fabric of a tent, and the massive weight of an animal that belonged out there far more than I ever did. The day went on, but I carried the weight of that morning with me. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow between the trunks seemed sharper, heavier, like it carried more meaning. I knew the bear was long gone, that it had probably fled far away after being startled, but the memory of it stayed behind. I had felt its weight on me, had seen the confusion in its eyes only steps away. That closeness doesn't fade quickly. Even years later, when I tell the story, it comes back with the same vividness. I remember the sound of the rustling, the sudden collapse, the press of air leaving my chest under the weight, the shock of seeing it standing there so close. I can picture the way the bushes looked trampled down, the shape of the paw prints in the damp soil. I can feel the silence after it ran, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath before it let the world return to normal. I can still taste the raw edge of fear in the back of my throat, the reminder of just how fragile I was in a place that belonged to creatures far stronger than me. And so the story ends clearly, not with mystery, not with some lingering shadow, but with the plain truth of it. A bear stumbled into us on a quiet morning in the middle of nowhere, and for one strange, unforgettable moment, I knew what it felt like to be sat on by something that could crush me without even trying. We lived through it, walked away unharmed, but with a memory carved sharp enough to last a lifetime. Out there, far from civilization, that's what survival sometimes means. Not winning, not conquering, but simply being lucky enough to stand up again after the weight is lifted. I had been out west for a couple weeks, wandering between trails and Forest Service roads, chasing that mix of silence and freedom that only comes when you are so far out that your phone has no signal. That valley I ended up in wasn't really planned. It was one of those decisions made after a long day of hiking where your legs feel like lead and you just want somewhere flat to park and crash. I had stayed late on a trail, probably later than I should have, and by the time I came down, it was already dusk. The trees swallowed the last of the light fast, and I was moving quick, trying to get back to my truck before real darkness hit. On the way down, I crossed paths with a local guy. One of those people you can tell lives out there full-time. The type who knows every bend of the river and every game trail like it's part of their own yard. He seemed friendly enough, easygoing, the kind of guy who didn't mind seeing a stranger out in his part of the woods. We talked a little, nothing deep, but he ended up pointing me toward a spot close to the road but tucked away. A place where I could camp without worrying about people driving by and spotting me. He told me it was near the river, hidden enough that unless you knew to look for it, you'd pass it right by. By the time I found the spot, it was completely dark. The kind of dark where the stars feel close but the ground is nothing but shadow. I built a small fire, cracked a couple beers, and set up my chair next to the flames. The sound of the river nearby was steady, like a low background hum. I put on one of my friend's comedy podcasts, loud enough that the laughter carried through the trees. For a while, I didn't think about the isolation, about being alone with no service and no one around for miles. I felt fine. I was loud, visible, and honestly a little careless. I didn't even bother with my tent. Instead, I decided I'd just crash in the back of my truck under the topper. All my gear was back there anyway, and the idea of messing around with poles and tarps in the dark didn't appeal to me. Laziness won, and I stretched out in the truck bed, the faint glow of the fire flickering against the topper's window as I drifted off. The night passed without anything waking me. At least nothing I noticed. I slept deep, probably thanks to the beer and the miles I had hiked earlier. When I opened my eyes the next morning, light was already filtering through the trees. It was cool, crisp, the kind of morning that makes you want coffee, but I didn't bother with that. I got the fire going again, cracked another beer, and started pulling things out for breakfast. The smell of bacon mixing with the wood smoke was one of those little luxuries that makes camping worthwhile. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought maybe I was still groggy, but when I looked toward the edge of camp, there was a man standing there. He was about 20 yards off, just at the line where the trees began. I hadn't heard him approach, and with the river's noise and the crackle of the fire, I realized someone could have come close without me knowing. He didn't announce himself, didn't say anything, didn't even look straight at me. Just stood there. The longer I looked, the stranger he seemed. His beard was long and matted, more like a nest than hair. His clothes were covered in plastic grocery bags, tied in knots all over his arms, chest, and legs. Not just one or two, but dozens, maybe 100. The bags shifted when he moved, rustling faintly. The way they clung to him made it impossible to tell what condition his actual clothes were in underneath. I tried to make it normal at first. I said something about the weather. Just a comment tossed out like you'd say to anyone. No reaction. I kept cooking, pretending it wasn't strange, but he didn't step closer, didn't leave. Just sort of hovered there at the edge. I asked if he wanted breakfast, lifted the skillet a little as if that would tempt him. Nothing. He started pacing slowly along the perimeter of my camp, not looking directly at me but circling, his head turning just enough to scan the area, as if he was checking everything but refusing to meet my eyes. That's when the unease began to settle in. This wasn't a hiker. This wasn't a fisherman wandering by. His silence wasn't normal. It was deliberate. Every step he took along the edge of the clearing felt calculated. The plastic bags crinkled with each movement. I offered him a beer, figuring maybe that would break the weird wall. Still nothing. No glance, no nod. Not even the smallest acknowledgement that I existed. He just kept moving, circling, then stopping with his back to me, standing there like some scarecrow dumped at the edge of my firelight. My hand was close to the bear spray the whole time. My knife was there too, tucked where I could reach it in a second. The situation wasn't going anywhere good. My pulse was starting to climb, and I realized how stupid it had been to make myself so visible the night before. Loud and obvious in a place where I had no backup. It hit me then that he could have been watching me while I slept in the truck. That thought made my stomach twist. What if he'd been just outside the tree line, waiting, listening to me snore, watching the fire burn down? If I had set up my tent, I'd have been in nothing but thin fabric with no lock, no protection. The laziness that kept me in the truck felt like the smartest move I'd ever made. The silence stretched on too long. Every second he ignored me built pressure until I couldn't take it anymore. I felt my throat dry up, my jaw tight. The fire popped. The river roared softly, and he just stood there, not leaving, not engaging. I snapped. I raised my voice sharp and hard, telling him he needed to either acknowledge me or leave right then. Nothing. Not even a twitch. That was it for me. I stood, bear spray in my hand, and took a couple steps toward him. The nozzle was pointed straight at his chest. That broke something in him. He didn't say a word, didn't glance back, just shifted his shoulders like they'd slumped, and started walking away. Not fast, not panicked, just slow, dragging steps, the plastic bags crinkling with every movement until he was swallowed by the trees again. I didn't waste a second. I dumped the skillet, stomped the fire, and threw everything I could into the back of the truck. My hands shook the whole time. Every crack of a branch in the woods made me whip my head around, certain he was circling back. The valley that had felt peaceful the night before now felt like a trap, and I wasn't about to sit in it any longer. I drove out fast, gravel spitting under my tires, my eyes flicking to the mirrors over and over like I expected to see him running behind me. Even once I hit the main road, I didn't slow down. The thought that sticks with me isn't what happened, it's what didn't. He never spoke, never moved toward me, never made a clear threat. But the way he acted, the silence, the circling, the refusal to acknowledge me, it all felt wrong in a way I can't shake. I'll never know if he was sizing me up, waiting for a moment when I wasn't ready, or if he was just lost in whatever world he lived in. What I do know is that I thank my own laziness for keeping me in the truck that night. If I had been in a tent, nothing but nylon between me and him, I don't think I would have slept at all, and maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have woken up the same way I did. When I was younger, around 14 or 15 years old, my family used to go camping at a state park every summer. It became something of a tradition, one of those yearly events you could count on no matter what else was going on in life. We'd load up the car with tents, sleeping bags, coolers packed with food, fishing rods, and all the little things you don't realize you need until you're already out there. Bug spray, extra flashlights, and spare batteries. The park wasn't too far from home, maybe a couple of hours by car, but it felt like a different world once you got there. Tall trees stretched overhead, the kind that block out most of the sky when you're walking through them. The ground was always covered in pine needles and leaves, soft in some places and uneven in others. At night, the sound of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl filled the air so completely that silence almost felt impossible. My family would usually set up in the same area, a spot not too close to the main road, but not too deep into the park either. There were about 10 or 12 campsites grouped together, each one with its own fire pit and picnic table. During the day, we would fish or swim in the lake, and at night everyone would gather around the fire. The adults would sit in their folding chairs, talking and drinking, while us kids would run around or tell scary stories until someone finally got tired enough to go to bed. It was during these nights that my friend and I started what we jokingly called the ritual. He was a year older than me and had been coming on these camping trips for about as long as I had. The two of us liked to wander off after everyone else had settled by the fire. At first, it was just around the campground, a way to pass the time, but it slowly turned into something more. We made it a point to walk into the woods every night. Sometimes it was just a short walk, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Other times we would go further, just to see how far we could get before we started to feel uncomfortable. We carried flashlights, of course, but part of the game was to see how far we could go without using them. Walking in the woods at night with no light is a strange experience. You can hear everything but see almost nothing, just vague shapes and outlines if your eyes adjust enough. The crunch of leaves under your feet sounds louder than it should. A branch snapping in the distance feels closer than it really is. It makes you aware of yourself in a way that doesn't happen during the day. This one night stands out in my memory more than any other. It was late in the summer, and the air was heavy and warm, but not uncomfortably so. The fire at our campsite had burned down to glowing coals, and most of the adults were either talking quietly or already turning in. My friend and I looked at each other, and without saying much, we both knew it was time for the ritual. We started down the familiar path into the woods. At first, we left our flashlights off, just letting our eyes adjust. The moon was out, but the trees were thick enough that only small patches of light filtered through. We walked side by side, trying not to make too much noise. Our goal that night was to go further than we ever had before, just to see if we could handle it. After a while, we were about half a mile from the nearest campsite. That might not sound like much, but in the dark, with no one else around, it felt like another world. The sounds of the campground, voices, laughter, the occasional clink of bottles were gone. All we had were the woods, the faint moonlight, and the sound of our own breathing. It was around then that we heard it. A sound behind us so soft at first that I wasn't sure it was real. It was like a whisper, faint and drawn out, the kind of sound that makes you stop without thinking. I froze, and my friend did too. We looked at each other, then spun around and clicked on our flashlights at the same time. The beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees, the undergrowth, the uneven ground. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. We laughed nervously, the way you do when you're not sure if something is funny, or if you're just trying to convince yourself it is. We turned the flashlights off again and kept walking, but I noticed I was paying a lot more attention to the sounds around us. Every rustle of leaves made my skin prickle. Then we heard it again. The same soft whispering, this time a little louder, a little closer. We both stopped dead in our tracks. It wasn't wind and it wasn't an animal. It was a person. That much was clear. We turned our flashlights back on, scanning the trees again, but still nothing. My stomach tightened, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Something about it didn't feel right. After a few seconds, we agreed without saying anything. It was time to head back. We turned around and started walking toward camp, moving quicker than before. The woods suddenly felt different, heavier somehow, like the trees were leaning in closer. Every step seemed louder, every sound sharper. That's when we saw her. At first, it didn't even register as a person. The beam of my flashlight caught movement low to the ground, and I thought it was an animal. But then I saw arms, legs, hair, a woman. She was crawling on her hands and knees through the dirt, whispering to herself. Her clothes were dark, almost blending in with the ground, and her hair hung in her face, tangled and messy. For a moment, I couldn't move. My friend's flashlight landed on her too, and that's when she stopped crawling. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked right at us. Her face was pale under the light, streaked with dirt. She stood up suddenly, swaying a little, and started mumbling something about looking for her campsite. Relief and fear tangled together in my chest. On one hand, she was just a person, not some strange thing in the woods. On the other hand, the way she moved, the way she whispered to herself, it was unsettling, unnatural in that setting. We didn't know what else to do, so we started walking with her, leading her back toward the direction of the campground. She stumbled a few times, and it was obvious she wasn't sober. The smell of alcohol and something else, something sharp and chemical, hung around her. The walk back felt twice as long as the walk out. Every step seemed to drag, and the whole time I kept thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't gone that far into the woods that night. She was in no condition to find her way back on her own. When we finally reached the edge of the campground, the noise of voices and the glow of fires came back into view. She pointed toward one of the sites, and sure enough, there was a group of people there, laughing and drinking around a fire. None of them seemed to have noticed she was missing. We led her over, and she stumbled into the circle of light. Her friends barely reacted, just gave a half-hearted laugh and made some comment about her wandering off. It was clear she had been drinking heavily, maybe more than that. My friend and I stood there for a moment, not really sure what to do. The whole thing felt surreal. We had gone out expecting nothing more than the usual thrill of being in the woods at night. And instead, we had stumbled onto something that could have ended very differently. On the walk back to our own campsite, neither of us said much. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a heavy, uneasy feeling. I kept picturing her crawling in the dirt, whispering to herself, the way she had looked when she first turned her face toward us. When we got back, everything was the same as when we left. The adults were still sitting by the fire, the glow of the coals lighting their faces. It was as if nothing had happened, but for me that night stuck. Even now, years later, I think about it sometimes. About how strange it was to hear whispers in the dark and turn to see someone moving like that on the ground. About how easily she could have stayed out there all night, lost and vulnerable, if we hadn't decided to push ourselves further than usual. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or anything supernatural, but it was real. And in some ways that made it scarier, because the truth is, you never know who or what you might find in the dark, and sometimes the things you stumble across are far stranger and far more unsettling than any story you could make up. That night taught me something I didn't forget. The woods can hide a lot, and sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the unknown. It's another person, lost or broken in ways you can't see until they're right in front of you.